저는 지난 6월 1일부로 이 세계경제위기와 원장에 취임한 남종현입니다. 그전에는 고려대학교에 한 28년 봉사했고요. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining our distinguished lecture forum so early this morning. I'm very happy to introduce Jeffrey Schott this morning as a speaker. And I think you are well aware of Jeffrey Schott because he has been here many times so far. The last visit was last February, giving a lecture on the U.S. trade policy in the Obama era. Today, he is going to give us a talk on more broader issue of international concern, including perhaps recent economic recovery and rising protectionism and drifting Doha development agenda, and of course including Korea-US FTA prospect, especially after the summit between Obama and Lee Myung-bak last June. He may try to find out common ground for policy collaboration between US and Korea on all of these issues. As you know very well, Jeffrey Schott is a foremost trade economist and I would say working Wikipedia on the US trade policy and the global trading system. When I used to hear the term working Wikipedia, I have some story behind it. When I wrote my invitation letter to you last week, I originally wrote a living dictionary of US trade policy and global trading system to describe Jeffrey Schott, because he has been in Washington so long and dealing with many US trade policy formulation, and as well as writing prolific articles and journals and books. Well, when I wrote my invitation letter to you, I first used the term a living dictionary instead of working micropedia. Then one of my staff members came to me, why don't you use working Wikipedia instead of living dictionary? Because living dictionary sounds like more old-fashioned and analog type of expression, while this working Wikipedia sounds like more modern and more like a digital age of expression. So I adopted his idea, but I still don't know the exact connotation of working Wikipedia. But I decided to use that word because I didn't want to look too much far behind of the times. So, so we have here Jeffrey Schott. Actually, he was participating in an APEC meeting in Singapore a few days ago, and we almost hijacked him to make a stop over here to deliver some speech on recent events, what happened between last February and now. There has been a lot of events we had, like G20 meeting in last April, and G8 meeting, and bilateral summit between US and Korea. So now, I think it's time for me to present Jeff to you to deliver an excellent speech. Well, why don't we welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much for organizing this event, for inviting me back. It's always a great pleasure to visit Korea and see my good friends, and it is a special honor to be welcomed by the Institute's new president, Dr. Nam. When I spoke to this group last February, I shared my views on trade policy, as Dr. Nam has said, and what was likely to happen in the Obama administration. Unfortunately, my predictions about rising protectionist pressures and continued drift in trade negotiations and in congressional consideration of the Chorus FTA have been validated. These challenges continue to confront both our countries, even as they create new opportunities for bilateral cooperation. And that's the broader context that I would like to discuss with you today on the broad U.S.-Korea economic partnership working together in a time of global crisis, and how our countries can work together to help resolve global economic problems. Now, it's well known we are suffering through the worst economic recession since the Great Depression. While the latest monthly data provides some welcome news, it is still too early to predict a robust recovery from the sharp declines of the past few quarters. Indeed, earlier this month, the IMF predicted that world output would decline by 1.4% in 2009 before weakly rebounding in 2010. U.S. GDP is projected to fall by 2.6%, which is a terrible result, except when compared to the much larger declines in Japan and in the euro area. The global recession would be even worse except for the significant gains in China and India. And even those countries are down sharply from peak growth levels earlier this decade. The relatively good news, is that the IMF predicts a solid upturn for the global economy in 2010, but with anemic growth in the G8 countries except China. Unemployment is likely to continue to rise. The U.S. unemployment rate recorded a 26-year high of 9.5% in June and is likely to exceed 10% by early next year. What this means is that we are likely to see continued pressure to subsidize and protect domestic industries in many of the world's largest countries, including the United States. Now, Korea has also taken a big hit, and I would be cautious about reading too much into the recent positive monthly trade numbers. While the Korean economy seems to be turning the corner, the pace of that recovery will depend importantly on the pace of global recovery. The IMF annual review of the Korean economy is more pessimistic about the near-term outlook than that of the Ministry of Strategy and Finance. It expects Korean GDP to decline by 3% this year and only weakly rebound in 2010, just like the United States. And just like the United States, Korea's unemployment rate will continue to rise into 2010. Now, this precipitous drop in global demand, coupled with the seizing up of trade finance last fall, has taken its toll on international trade. Trade has plunged 24% over the past 2 quarters, about 4 times as fast as the decline in global output. And this is in stark contrast to the experience of the past 50 years, during which time trade increased about 3 times as fast as output. The latest IMF data predict that the volume of world trade in goods and services will decline by more than 12% this year and will not grow much in 2010. So that's the situation, that's the crisis that we face, and one that does not merit a great deal of exuberance in terms of future prospects. Dealing with the global crisis is a top priority for both our countries. The Obama administration secured a massive $800 billion stimulus bill to counter an economy that Larry Summers admitted at a lecture at my institute just last Friday, that the U.S. economy was, quote unquote, in free fall when they entered office last January. In addition, the Treasury and the Fed has had to commit hundreds of billions of dollars to help shore up the capital base of major financial institutions and to underwrite the restructuring of General Motors and Chrysler during their rapid bankruptcy process. So we have had a massive crisis, and we're not out of the woods yet in the United States, though there is hope that the economy has bottomed out and will hopefully begin to soon recover. Now, in Korea, as you know better than I, the Korean government has also intervened extensively to bolster Korean industries and to limit job losses. Each of us will continue to deal with our own economic challenges, but neither of us will fully succeed unless there is marked and sustained improvement in the global recovery, in the global economy. So that is a key point. We both are going to be doing a lot at home to deal with our economic stress. But we will need to be working together to ensure a sustained global economic recovery if we want to have confidence that the actions we take at home will bring us long-term prosperity. Now, the United States has long been in a leadership position in the global economy, but that is no longer sufficient. And we have seen an evolution of the governance of the global economy move from the G2 of the years when I was in government, which was the U.S. and Europe, moving to Quad countries involving Japan and Canada, expanding to G7 countries, primarily Europe again, but recently including China and Russia in a G8. None of these are really sufficient when you look at the spread of economic importance and dominance of many countries that emerged from the depths of poverty in the immediate post-war era and have now become legitimate economic superstars. And Korea is in that group of countries that now merit a place at the table, but unlike many others, countries that have been willing to assume the responsibilities of leadership and to work to help promote better global economic governance. And I think that's a key factor that has changed only recently in this global economic crisis. And it's quite significant that Korea was named to be part of the leadership troika in the G20 and is taking a very active role in trying to push multilateral initiatives to help support coordinated economic recovery and to plan for growth in the coming years. As a result, the U.S.-Korea partnership has now taken on a new dimension. Not only are we working together to deal with bilateral issues, but we are now, more importantly, in this time of economic stress, working together as responsible leaders of the global economy. And that's what I mean by a deepening of the U.S.-Korea economic partnership. And there, the big change, again, is Korea's new participation. Its pivotal role in the leadership troika of the G20 with the United Kingdom and Brazil, and its likely efforts that will lead to it hosting the first G20 meeting in 2020, an event that has not yet been confirmed but likely will be at the next G20 meeting in Pittsburgh in late September. Among the factors influencing this partnership. I think a lot of credit has to go to Dr. Sagong-il, the founder of the Institute for Global Economics and a very close friend of my institute, and of course one of the leading economic advisors in the Korean government. He has played a very important role in coordinating G20 actions on macroeconomic policy and on trade, and has a close working relationship with Larry Summers in the White House and with other top economic officials in the other G20 countries. I think this has been very critical to coordinating the macroeconomic response to the crisis. It's also been critical in an area that I deal much more closely with, and that is international trade negotiations. Because the G20 is acting to try to prevent an implosion in world trade that could be the likely political response to economic downturns at home. The first response of politicians often is to protect and subsidize at home and discriminate against foreign suppliers. And we've seen that in many instances in stimulus programs and government purchasing regulations that discriminate against outside suppliers, in subsidizing domestic firms as they undergo restructuring in the face of the economic downturn. So one needs to both, in this context, resist protectionism and to further liberalization. I suspect that the G20, after its pronouncements on protectionism, which I'll talk about in a moment, will make a big effort to try to revive the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations. There's already extensive efforts and underway in that regard. And the reason is simple, and the reason why this has been an issue both in the G20 meetings and in the recent G8 summit in Italy, where the Doha round was one of the main topics of discussion. And it is simply this. Trade has to be part of the solution to our global economic crisis. Otherwise, it will continue to be part of the problem, limiting economic recovery. And sending a clear signal that countries will further open their markets and increase competition, I think, is critical to allow to giving the major economies the tools to resist the protectionist calls in their own countries. And I'd be happy to talk a lot more about that in question and answers, but if I go into too much detail on the Doha round, I think we'll not have enough time to discuss some of the key other challenges that face our two countries and where we're working together. Suffice it to be said that I gave a prescription for solving the Doha round puzzle in my speech in Singapore a few days ago, and it seems to be a strategy that is gaining resonance both in the U.S. government and among the G20 countries. And it requires a renewed effort to negotiate on agriculture, manufactures, and services with the view to trying to conclude a negotiation by the end of 2010, as the G8 leaders committed, but probably more likely early in 2011. It is a feasible target, but it requires action at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh in September to push the ministers to get back to the negotiating table and start the very intensive work needed to craft the final Doha package. To that end, I might add that President Obama plans to give a major speech on trade policy, likely before the G20 summit, in which he will frame moving forward on trade as part of the broader response to the global economic crisis, and hopefully remove a lot of the concerns and anxieties that were created by his more rash comments about trade during the presidential campaign when he was in hand-to-hand combat with his now Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That harsh rhetoric during the political campaign has given way to more nuanced and broader trade concerns as he has assumed the responsibility of governance. And I now think we see a president in the United States that is firmly committed to an open multilateral trading system and to concluding the Chorus FTA, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. Let me turn now to what the G20 is doing and about the immediate concern about rising protectionism. Given the fragility of the global economic conditions, we need to ensure that we don't make a bad situation worse by restricting opportunities for trade and investment. And that is easier said than done. There's a lot of pressure to do so, and policymakers will continue to face protectionist pressures for two related reasons. First, unemployment will continue to rise even after the economy stabilizes and begins to recover, since firms are cautious about adding to payrolls until their order books are on firmer footing. Even with modest economic growth reemerging in 2010, it will take some time to get back to the levels of economic output achieved before the current recession. And so it will be some time before the man in the street and the local businessman feel that they are as well off as they were a few years ago. That's important to keep in mind. It's not just that we have turned the corner and beginning to recover. It is that we are in a deep hole, and until we get out of that hole, we are not back to where we were even a few years ago. Second, to remedy these problems, politicians understandably want public funds deployed to increase local jobs and to benefit local companies, as I said before, and thus insist that national stimulus programs favor projects with high domestic content. The U.S. program is illustrative of this problem, and unfortunately, it is being emulated by China and other countries. Now, to be sure, the G20 summit declarations in Washington last November and in London in April pledged to avoid new protectionism. And I might say that Korean leaders, President Lee and Dr. Sogong and others, were at the forefront in pushing for a very strong standstill commitment. And they got it. The London leaders agreed not to raise, quote, new barriers to investment or to trade in goods and services, impose new export restrictions, or implement World Trade Organization inconsistent measures to stimulate exports. And they added through the end of 2010. In addition, they agreed, and this was almost a direct language from the Korean leaders, they agreed to notify the WTO and rectify promptly measures inconsistent with that pledge. Though I'm sorry to report that to date, no G20 country has yet done so. But overall, the G20 participants have done better than expected, but not as good as they should have done, given the depth and breadth of the global crisis. Some G20 members violated the pledge before the ink was dry on the Washington Summit Declaration, and several of those measures remain in force today. The trade standstill was misunderstood and misapplied. Some countries took it simply to mean honor WTO obligations, but under WTO rules, countries legally can impose a wide range of protectionist measures, whether via anti-dumping and safeguard actions or other ways. And moreover, in areas where WTO disciplines are incomplete or absent, such as in government procurement, countries can discriminate against foreign suppliers without worry about WTO censure. And in fact, many of the standstill violations fall in this latter category. And that's why WTO negotiations are needed to strengthen multilateral disciplines over such actions and the importance of having a concrete and substantive result in the Doha round. But the basic point here is straightforward. Amid global crisis, the objective should be to avoid measures that distort international trade and investment, whether WTO legal or not, because such actions inhibit global recovery today and clog the arteries of prospective growth going forward. Now, what can be done about this? Well, the G20 started by issuing the declaration. And last December, I and other trade experts called for the WTO and the World Bank to closely monitor these developments and name and shame countries that violated their summit commitments. To his credit, Pascal Lamy, the head of the WTO, took up this task, or at least the naming part. International officials don't like to do shaming of their member governments. And the WTO now issues quarterly reports on the financial and economic crisis and trade-related developments. And the latest report was issued just last week and noted an uptick in restrictive measures, but voiced relief that actions were not as widespread as feared. In essence, by putting a spotlight on prospective abuses, public monitoring of the G20 policies has helped constrain a surge of new protectionist measures. But as we go forward to the next summit in Pittsburgh and then on to the prospective summit in Seoul, probably in April of next year, the United States and Korea should continue their efforts to broaden the scope of this standstill commitment and to ensure that it is faithfully implemented. Now, a lot more can be said about what we need to do together on trade, both resisting protectionism and furthering liberalization. That will occur as our two governments begin the preparations for Pittsburgh and then continue on to see the role of the G20 as it evolves in 2010 under Korean leadership. It will be a critical period for global economic governance because it could well mark a clear decline in the influence of the G8, which has not done very much, in all honesty, in recent years, and a increased credibility and influence for the G20, in which Korea now plays a very crucial role. And if that institutional change begins to evolve, it will have important implications not only for our bilateral partnership, but for Korea's influence in its own region and in the Asia-Pacific region, because the G20, if you look at the G20, about half its members come from the APEC region. So it will perhaps shift some of the balance of authority and power in global economic governance away from the transatlantic area region to the Asia-Pacific. And I say that because Ambassador McDonald is here, and I want to make sure that he gets fired up to ask some questions. But there's another area where we have common interest and common need to work together, and that's with regard to climate change. Climate change represents a global challenge of critical importance. Reducing emissions of greenhouse gases requires substantial and sustained efforts by all the major emitters, developed and developing countries alike. No global regime can succeed unless all the major emitters substantially reduce their carbon footprints. That said, developing countries need to take the lead by committing to drastic cuts in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and to sizable starts toward that goal by 2020, and by providing technical and financial assistance to major developing countries that undertake substantial and reciprocal commitments to do so. Both Korea and the United States have put great emphasis on this issue, and in the wake of the financial crisis have sought to promote energy and environmental policies that create incentives for low carbon and green growth. President Obama ranks global warming among his top priorities. Both the $800 billion stimulus package and his 10-year budget blueprint emphasize green growth with incentives for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and smart grid and electricity transmission. And of course, the administration is investing a lot of political capital in the passage of new climate change legislation. The House of Representatives recently passed, by a narrow margin, the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009, which is known in Washington as the Waxman-Markey bill, and the issue is now being debated in the Senate. The legislation would institute a cap-and-trade system that would require sharp reductions in greenhouse gas emissions over time, but with ample subsidies for domestic industries during the initial adjustment period through either free allocations of emissions permits or by direct subsidy. Despite the House vote, however, a lot of work remains before a bill can reach the desk of President Obama. At best, the Senate might vote on its own bill in October, which will likely differ in important respects from the House bill and thus require negotiation in a House-Senate conference. That conference is unlikely this year, so the U.S. delegation will probably go to Copenhagen, the Copenhagen summit in December of 2009, without a firm legislative mandate, but perhaps with a good idea of what that mandate is likely to be if the Copenhagen process is productive. Similar progress is being made in Korea. Since President Lee took office, Korea has actively promoted a new paradigm of low carbon and green growth, introduced a Green New Deal policy aimed at creating jobs and shifting to a lower carbon future. Internationally, Korea has clearly shown its leadership on this issue as well by its commitment to fix a target rate of greenhouse gas emissions in the Copenhagen Accord. There's a clear interest in working to secure a new global accord for no other reason, and Korea's interest can be defined very simply. It resides downwind from the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And so it's in Korea's vital interest to ensure that there is a global regime and one that accommodates the full participation of China and other countries. Now that will be the challenge, how to get countries, rich and poor alike, to contribute to policy reforms, regulatory reforms that actually affect economic activity in their own countries. Because if you're talking about climate change, what you're really talking about is adding a price to a previously free good, carbon. And depending on the level of that price, that will affect what is produced, how it is produced, and where it is produced. And so it has consequences both for resource reallocation, redistribution within countries and between countries. And that makes the task of crafting a global climate regime all the more difficult, particularly when industrial countries have a long history of emitting greenhouse gases, and developing countries who are rapidly increasing their level of emissions have only done so for a few decades in substantial quantities. So there are equity questions and ones that will require transfer of resources from the rich to the poor to support and expand the ability of developing countries to introduce new technologies and pollution control equipment that will help them meet the global need to reduce greenhouse gases. To get that meaningful outcome will require a broader partnership by the United States and Korea in ways that support both our global ambitions and our national economic policies to pursue low-carbon green growth. This is something that I think will become ever more important on the bilateral relationship, but will require ever more cooperation in international forums as we begin to craft the Copenhagen Accord and elaborate the details of that accord in the years ahead. Now, Mr. Chairman, I could not leave this podium without talking about an issue that you highlighted in your introduction, and I suspect that the Chorus FTA is the issue on which most of you are eager to hear my views. And I have saved it for last for a simple reason. The goodwill generated by working together on the big global economic issues I have just discussed should, I believe, carry over to the bilateral agenda and help strengthen the commitments of both our countries to overcome the remaining obstacles to implementing the Chorus FTA. Now, I remain optimistic that the Chorus FTA will be approved by Congress within probably the next 6 to 9 months, and that's a forecast that I probably cannot stake my life on. But I think there are several reasons for my optimism. First, there's a substantive reason. The harsh criticism of the auto provisions of the pact and other aspects of the pact that have been criticized in the United States and Korea have been ill-considered to begin with and are now even less convincing given the drastic changes in auto output and employment in both countries. The Chorus FTA was signed more than 2 years ago, and since that period of time there has been a sharp contraction in output and employment in the auto sector. This year, U.S. auto sales are running at an annualized rate of a little over 9.5 million units, sharply down from the 17 million unit sales of a few years ago. Big three sales, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, which may now be called the Little Three, have been cut by about 40% compared to 2008. And it's interesting that Hyundai and Kia, by contrast, have recorded small increases this year in their sales in the U.S. market. What this implies is that good marketing helps companies and bankruptcy hurts companies. An anomaly that goes back more than 45 years, a 25% tariff that would be phased out over 10 years in the Chorus FTA. And the objective was to encourage investment in Korean production facilities of SUVs so that they could be exported to the United States and other major markets. Well, the SUV demand for SUVs in the U.S. has imploded. There are not many people are buying these cars anymore, and it is very highly unlikely that even with the elimination of the tariff, that anyone would want to invest in new production facilities in Korea or anywhere else. So that's just one example of how things have changed. But there are other aspects, including the bankruptcy of GM and Chrysler, the massive amount of subsidies that the U.S. government has put into those firms that have also affected the competitive situation and I think nullified a lot of the criticisms about the Chorus FTA commitments and criticisms which I didn't think had much substantive merit to begin with. There's a lot more that can be said about that, and I intend to say that in Washington where the decisions will have to be made to move forward. Second reason for optimism, and that comes to the hard work of negotiators in Korea and the European Union, because the imminent signing and implementation of the EU-Korea FTA raises a real competitive challenge for U.S. automakers in the Korean market. My colleague Fred Bergston likes to talk about competitive liberalization. Well, this is a clear example of competitive liberalization, where the initial U.S. Negotiations with Korea spurred Europe to emulate our initiative so as not to disadvantage European firms in the Korean market and to gain some of the benefits that accrue from a more open competition. Well, the Congress, in its delay, is making it hard for the U.S. to reap the benefits of the trade negotiation, while it looks like, coming from behind, the European firms and workers will get an advantage over U.S. firms and workers in sales to the Korean market, unless the Congress reverses its resistance to moving forward. I think this is a type of issue that is very clear and straightforward to a congressman. It's a question about having a level playing field and noting that the inaction by the Congress is creating the disadvantage for their own constituents. And I think that will be a strong argument for reviewing and reassessing the pace of consideration of the Chorus FTA in the Congress. But third, and most important, I think because of the recent developments in North Korea, these recent developments underscore the overriding importance of a strong U.S. and Korea alliance for our mutual security interest. This lesson, I think, has been made very clear in the numerous meetings that President Obama and President Lee have had over the past 6 months. And I think this realization, which really was a clear signal out of the early meetings that Secretary Clinton had when she was here in February of this year, and have continued through the very frequent contacts between top officials of both our governments, I think underscores the need that it doesn't make any sense to have a small commercial matter about a few provisions of a major trade agreement create friction in an incredibly important bilateral alliance. That's the issue that I think overwhelmingly will tilt congressional opinion in favor of supporting the Chorus FTA. There's a lot we can do about that in the coming months. Clearly, when the issue comes on the legislative agenda is a bit complicated, given the president's push to do an awful lot in his first year of office, including fundamental health care reform and climate change reform. But I think there is a great window of opportunity for the Congress to act, if not at the end of this year, then early next year. And it would be a wonderful opportunity for President Obama to come to Seoul for the G20 summit in April of next year, carrying in hand congressional passage of the Chorus FTA. And it's my sincere hope that that will happen, because that will seal our partnership in a very positive way and ensure that we continue to work closely together for our mutual interests in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
It was very informative, not only informative, but also very useful address, I think. And we usually have Q&A session after this lecture. And I was told by Jeff Schott last night that he really enjoyed the Q&A session last time because the audience level was highest he could find all over the world, I think. So this IGE group has that kind of reputation. I was very glad to hear that. Ask your questions in Korean or in English, any kind. So if you have any questions or comments, this is the first come, first serve. You raise your hand. Okay?
Dr. Schott, you really covered all the subjects of interest. So let me move on to a more esoteric or the conceptual question. The issue of free trade overriding. Now, two questions. Number one is that, yes, I think it was a good idea that Lehman Brothers and Sakung have been advocating stand still. But you know that when politicians agree, those pronouncements of agreement will never be met. At best, they probably have met. So stand still itself is quite inadequate in view of all the pressures domestically to override it. And therefore, they perhaps, I understand why they asked for stand still, but perhaps we should be asking far greater commitment from the government than mere stand still, and that's the first part. I think as you pointed out, the trade is a very important issue. In that regard, I want to move on to the bigger issue of global free trade. As you know, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati has been the ardent supporter of the global free trade, and he has been very well known for the disdain for the FTAs, as calling it spaghetti balls. But one of the problems is that issues are becoming so complex right now. He recognizes that no progress can be made effectively. When 166 nations gather and you have thousands of pages piled up, most of those countries cannot read these things, let alone understand, and therefore the only thing they can do is disagree to everything which is proposed. So that being the reality, how do we move forward to solve that issue? Now, G20 may be some help as the means of getting the consensus, but in the end, I think we have to have something which is a little more effective to make the movement forward. Another thing we can do perhaps is, if you look at the United States, the 57 states have their own commercial codes. Now, if they all had insisted on their own unique commercial codes, no commerce could take place in the United States. The only way they can effectively move is because they have UCC, patterned after a standard form. If there is some movement toward making that kind of agreement at least, so that while they make bilateral or trilateral kind of agreements, would you move towards some uniform standard form so that eventually you could come to some global agreement of some kind? What do you think of those ideas of somehow proposing two things? Getting a mechanism of global governance, of effectively reaching the agreement. It should compare to the United Nations rather than the United General Assembly. The Security Council is more effective if you eliminate the vetoes or some sort of agreement of that nature.
That should be the topic of my next lecture here, because it to answer it fully would take a good 45 minutes. Let me just give you a preview of what the lecture might include. First of all, you're absolutely right that the standstill has been incomplete, and that's why I said the agreement was misunderstood and misapplied. But a big part of the problem is that when trade officials get together, they still think that what they are supposed to work on primarily is border barriers, tariffs and the like. And tariffs are not very important in most areas today because of the extensive progress that has been made both in GATT and WTO negotiations and in bilateral and regional free trade agreements. So there are some exceptions, particularly in agriculture, but the real problems and the major distortions to international trade and investment come from discriminatory practices involved through domestic regulations. And that is much harder to get international consensus to harmonize, because those regulations are designed to allocate resources among different constituencies in each country. and are designed pursuant to the particular conditions in those countries. And so to get everyone to say we'll have a common regulatory regime is very difficult. And it's further complicated by the fact, and this has come up frequently in the U.S.-Europe context, where we have sought to harmonize regulatory policies. And have found that even in countries with high standards like the United States and Europe, find it difficult to harmonize pharmaceutical regulations or other types of competition regulations because companies have invested in the current state of regulation. And if you change that regulation, you may undercut the value of that investment. So this is something that I think has not been as well understood. And when I have talked to transatlantic officials, I've said if you want to start harmonizing, you should start in the area of emerging technologies where the regulations haven't been set in concrete yet and stimulated investment that will object to changing that regulation. Second point on your comment on getting to global free trade. Are there too many countries? Yes and no. The good news is there are many more countries that merit a seat at the table than when Ambassador McDonnell and I negotiated more than 30 years ago. And so they have an interest in getting some benefits from the trade negotiation. Now, most of those countries are not being asked to do very much in the Doha round. And if you look at what is going on in Geneva, the real bottleneck is among 10 or 15 countries that are major players and have major interests that are not easy to converge. And there will be no agreement, multilateral, bilateral, regional, unless you can find some way to seek accommodation with these major players. Korea is now joined that group. And that's why I was trying to emphasize in rather general terms the importance of building coalitions among the leadership countries to bridge differences between competing economies, in particular to ensure the active participation of China. And that is crucial. It is an era of coalitional politics in the world trading system that is a lot different than in previous eras, and you need to develop that. I don't believe global governance will succeed in that accord. That's the ultimate objective of the WTO in the trade area. But as the WTO officials have discovered, most of the problems that they deal with are not fully trade problems. And indeed, trade is often just a small part of the problem. And so they don't have the competence, nor do trade ministers have the competence to make the decisions necessary to change national policies to have broader international agreement. That will require some change in the way the WTO does business in the future and with whom it does business. But it will also require important changes in the organization of national governments. And I can tell you from my own experience in the United States, there are big firewalls between the State Department, Treasury, USTR, and the like, which should be working together but often have their own bureaucratic priorities. And that is emulated, I'm sure, in many other countries.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeff, very much once again for this update, such a comprehensive update on the state of the world economy and the prospects for the Korea-U.S. relationship. I have 3 questions. I raise them, state them very briefly each. First, about the G20. We all know that the launching of the G20 summit process was a reaction to this global economic crisis. Now, we are not out of the woods yet, as you said, but it seems that the global economy has at least touched the bottom, so our global outlook for the global economy is changing. And in accordance, maybe the agenda for G20 summit has to adjust as well. And what do you think is likely to be the focus of the agenda for G20 in Pittsburgh, as well as for that which I hope will be held in Korea early next year? And one additional question. Do you think that G20 summit is likely to replace the G8 summit process for good? As we know, G20 summit as it is now is institutionally insecure. And secondly, about the climate change, you implied by saying that President Obama is not likely to reach a deal on its carbon emissions with the U.S. Congress by December this year, and you implied by saying that the international community is unlikely to reach a deal in Copenhagen about the post-2012 climate change regime. So you have implied that probably the schedule of negotiation will have to be extended into the future. And in that regard, what do you think is the likely timeline for the conclusion of the climate change deal? And thirdly, about the Korea-US FTA, I was very pleased to hear your now rather sanguine assessment of the prospects for the FTA ratification in the US Congress. Now my one question, we've been talking about a possible request from the Washington side for side agreement to complement the FTA document. Do you think that any such side agreement is still necessary, or can you do without it? And in that connection, do you think the existing restrictions on importation of American beef to Korea could pose a problem in the Congress in that context?
You should have said, Dr. Nam, that the questions have always been short and simple, and encourage the audience to continue that trend. Instead, you encourage them to continue to make my life difficult. But these are all very good questions, both sets of questions. First, with regard to the G20, you're right that we are beginning to come to the phase that we have to ask these questions. What should the G20 do? And should it have a more secure institutional role? And I think going into Pittsburgh, more focus will be on still the immediate tasks of coordination, prospects for international financial reform, and reviving the Doha round. As I said before, there is a great deal of activity already, continuing today in Singapore among trade ministers, discussing what needs to be done to accelerate the pace of Doha negotiations. The new Indian Commerce Minister will host a meeting of some trade ministers in Delhi in early September, and that could help develop some ideas for overcoming the obstacles to agreement on the agricultural, on the modalities, the technical term in Geneva, for the rules of negotiation on agriculture and manufacturers. So I think that, and I'm hoping that President Obama's speech will also contribute to setting the table for a constructive result on trade in the Pittsburgh summit. What happens then subsequently, I think is very important for institutional reasons and substantive reasons. And the more that can be done to elaborate the standstill, to do more on Doha means that the Seoul meeting next year would have to spend more time seeing if the benchmarks for progress are being achieved and ensuring that that the activity bears some fruit, or perhaps teeing up prospective issues for compromise. But there, a lot more has to be done, and I would think that we will have a number of conferences in Korea, in the United States, and elsewhere in the fall and winter of next year, discussing and brainstorming on how best to proceed on the institutional side with the G20. Will it replace the G8? Well, the G8, these types of institutions, it's hard to disband them, but it's also hard to put a lot of credence in them, given their poor track record over the recent years. So I think there will be more priority given to some elaboration or hybrid beyond the G8, because the G8 has not proved very effective. On climate change, let me be a little more clear on what I think will happen in the U.S. and internationally. It will be very difficult to reach an agreement this year between what the House wants to do and what the Senate wants to do in climate change legislation. The disagreements are not as much over the overall target as the way the pain will be distributed among different constituencies, and the ways that those groups will be subsidized through free allocations or tax expenditures. And that will cause, I think, a delay in passage of U.S. legislation probably into next year. But there will be already a clear signal that the Congress is committed to a cut of 20% in overall U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 from a base year of, I think, 2005. So that should be helpful in working out the general terms of a Copenhagen interim accord this December. But I expect that the negotiators in Copenhagen will fall short of their goals and at best reach an interim pact with only a few hard will reach an interim pact with few hard numbers, and those hard numbers will have to be fleshed out over the next year or two. And so we won't have a clear idea, and indeed that will provide some flexibility in dealing with the contribution that developing countries might take, because clearly with the very limited progress that has been made so far this year, it is very unlikely that you would get any hard commitments from the major emitters in the developing world. Finally, on the Chorus FTA, you asked about side packs. Well, I think after a great deal of uncertainty and ambiguity about whether the agreement, whether the Obama administration would call for the renegotiation of the pact, I think it is becoming increasingly clear that it is in nobody's interest to have that. And now the discussions, or at least as I understand it, the bilateral consultations between senior officials is on ways to augment the agreement with bilateral cooperation accords in areas that would benefit both countries, particularly in sectors that had been subject of concern, including the automotive sector. So I could see accords that look into joint efforts to develop new engine technologies, pollution control technologies, some things that are already being done in part by the private sector. Korea has some of the firms with the leading technologies in electric batteries and are already working with U.S. counterparts. And so I could see that being consolidated and providing a reason for politicians to say this is going to be better for our constituents in light of everything else that has happened. Beef, we've resolved most of the problem. There's a little bit more to do, and Senator Baucus is very concerned about it, but he's also very concerned that the deal get done. And so when you have uncertainty about a broader opposition from a manufacturing sector, you don't have to sit down and think hard about making the decisions to go forward. Now that we're moving to a point, for the reasons I said before, that I think we will be closer to a decision point, I think these issues will be put into perspective. And I'm sure Senator Baucus, who wants to have this deal ratified, will find a way to work with both U.S. and Korean officials to ensure that the deal gets done.
Thank you very much for your enlightening presentation, Mr. Schott. I want to ask a bit different question. That one paper I read several months back, it says that aggregate debt of America reached 350% of American GDP. I mean, aggregate debt of some of debt owed by public sectors, corporations, and consumers. And it says that the ultimate solution and long-term solution of this global financial crisis and economic recession should come from by American consumers pay back their debts more and consume less. And then if it happens, that will definitely slow down the global trade and also slow down economic recovery. And also for your information, Korean number, GDP, I mean that debt of Korean aggregate debt is 26% of GDP as of March this year. And if we have to pay back debts and reduce debt numbers, I mean the exit strategy I'm talking, what do you think that should be appropriate percentage of that debts to GDP, and how long should it take to reach that level? I appreciate your comments.
I'm probably not the best person in my institute to give you a specific answer to your last question on debt ratios. So I don't want to confuse the issue by saying something off the top of my head in which I haven't done a great deal of study. But the issue of the increasing debt burden in our societies is important. There will have to be an increase in savings, and so that will have an impact on projected growth rates for the next decade or more. Now, what impact will this have on trade if the U.S. consumer buys less? That really depends. It will clearly affect the composition of trade. But if we have more investment, then we will continue to trade more, but different types of products. Maybe less cell phones. Though we need better cell phones in the United States. Our cell phones don't work very well. We get the old cell phones that children in Korea no longer will tolerate. Those older models then get sold to the United States. so there's a question of how it will affect the composition of trade. It also is a question of whether that investment will lead to higher growth rates. And higher growth rates then lead to higher volumes of trade. So clearly there will be a change. We will not see the types of consumer consumption and import demand in the United States that fueled the binge of the past decade. But we will see some reorientation, restructuring of the growth. The bigger problem is if we don't see that restructuring and the debt continues to build, and that's a formula for a big inflationary spurt over the medium to longer term. Probably not in the next few years, but there is a concern, and I know Chairman Bernanke has mentioned that frequently in his comments, that if we don't deal with some of these problems, we will have growing inflationary pressures in the out years.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I would like to make advice or comment on the U.S.-Korea FTA and one information or comment of Korea solar energy development. First one, I appreciate 3 points of positive way of thinking of the U.S.-Korea FTA forecast of progress. Besides the three points you eloquently mentioned, I'd like to add one advice for you to persuade that U.S. Congress or anti-Korea FTA people. The Korea-U.S. FTA is one of the pilot case for U.S. PRC FTA in the long run, and also U.S.-Japan FTA in the long run. So this Korea-U.S. FTA is one of the pilot case. One living example is I put my U.S.-Korea FTA agreements in Japanese and English article on my friends in Japanese friends in Tokyo, who is the General Director of Economic Planning Board, Mr. Kogane Yoshihiro. That homepage for U.S.-Korea FTA article visited more than 500 people, Japanese experts. So they are concerned whether Korea-U.S. FTA is successfully launched or not. They will launch Korea-Japan FTA, as well as China case. I'm a member of Northeast Asia Economic Forum, presided by Dr. Lee J. Cho in University of Hawaii. And Chinese people watch closely Korea and US FTA. They would like to launch after the successful US-Korea FTA, launch Korea-China FTA. So that makes Korea is the showcase of the U.S. Northeast Asia FTA front. I don't think this Doha round will be successful because this FTA one is stacked up one by one. Then the Doha round in a long run will be succeed. Second, Korea solar energy development. I went to Hanam, the solar energy plant, and all that equipment is imported from Japan, not Korea made or US made. From Japanese Kyocera and the Sangyo is this solar panel. My point is that Korean government made a subsidy to the solar energy, but everybody rushed in solar energy plant because to get the subsidy. So it's now going to suspend the solar energy project. So the one who is going to make it is a great loss. It's the case of a solar energy like that. And the same story goes that windmill project too. So it's also very, very difficult position in make a subsidy in the long run. That is my information to you. Thank you.
Clearly, when the Chorus FTA was negotiated, the U.S. felt that it would encourage further agreements in the region, and it has. The first one is the EU-Korea free trade agreement. But in the short term, I am not sure that we will see rapid progress on Korean negotiations with either China or Japan. With regard to Japan, they now have some political weakness in the government, and I think even after the election, they will be in a difficult position to pursue a comprehensive free trade agreement. And indeed, many of the problems that have stalled those negotiations since December 2004 will probably remain difficult for a weak coalition to address. With regard to China, I agree that there is interest in both countries in pursuing a free trade agreement. I think there are substantive differences in what each thinks should be in that trade agreement and what priorities should be given. So either it will be a rather interim accord that does not have a great deal of commercial implications, that sets a framework for building in the future. That may be possible, but I don't think a commercially significant deal is likely in the very near term. So I don't think either of those initiatives will complicate the revival of Doha. On your comments on solar energy and subsidies, I think you make a very important point that just giving money to companies for technologies is not sufficient. There has to be some accountability. There has to be some ways of accessing the grid, concern about distribution of energy and the like, some competition. And so, as we in the United States saw in our subsidies for biofuels, it can create great distortions in the signals it sends to investors and lead to some uneconomic decisions that are made. We would hope that in the future we look more at private-public partnerships that have more market discipline, and I think that's the direction the industry is going. But there will be need to do more on smart grid. I know Dr. Cherrenbaum is here, and IBM is doing a lot of work on that. And so these are areas where I think both our countries can benefit from working with each other and innovating with each other.
Jeff, since you're coming from APEC meeting, let me ask APEC-related question. This is one area Korea and the U.S. have had very good relationship, and very cooperative, and perhaps collaborative too. And about 16 years ago, in 1993, U.S. hosted the APEC meeting in Seattle, Blake Island's leadership meeting. And that was the first year of a Bill Clinton administration. And he took a leadership role in this process, APEC Forum. And for the next several years, APEC made very good progress. And after this year's APEC meeting in Singapore, APEC meeting goes back to the U.S. next year, right?
Japan next year.
Japan and then the U.S., right? So soon, U.S. will have another opportunity, especially Obama, President Obama. And incidentally, in 2010 is the year that, if anybody remembers, of the Boer statement stated saying that 2010 and 2020, what was the actual phrase was complete liberalization of trade and investment by 2010 for developed countries, and 2020 for developing countries. Right? So, do you think the leaders will meet in the next next year in Japan, and then perhaps followed by a U.S. meeting of APEC? Address that question, the issue. And, as I was saying last night, perhaps the only leader who is still there in the leader group would be Sultan of Brunei, and all other leaders are either dead or out of a job. I think I would like to ask you your assessment on what the Obama administration's position would be or could be regarding APEC issues, especially on the Boer statement, the goals.
Is that as the Obama administration reassesses its trade policy and sets its new priorities, it is increasingly clear that the Asia-Pacific region and U.S. relations with Asia will be a top priority for the U.S. Trade Representative and for the White House. And I suspect that that will be spelled out in the President's speech as well. So that will give a focus. And the work that is being done in Singapore this week and in the coming months leading up to the APEC Ministerial and Leaders Summit in November, I think will start setting the table for initiatives that will be carried forward in Japan and in the United States in 2011. I mean, given President Obama's background, I suspect he may want to have the APEC summit in Honolulu, which would make it a true Asia-Pacific meeting, and of course allow him to go back to where the town where he grew up. Now, in terms of substance, Bogor commitments were made in a different era, and yes, the Sultan of Brunei was there. So was Hillary Clinton, and so was Fred Bergston, and he's going to be in Singapore this November as well. But I don't think many people looked at how the APEC initiative has evolved and thought that there was going to be a remarkable transformation of government policy in 2010 and that we'd have free trade. Rather, I think what the realization among APEC members, and it's a growing number. It originally was 12, and now it is 21. And that increase in the membership has made it much more difficult to reach consensus on anything in APEC, particularly on economic integration that involves countries of largely divergent levels of economic development. plus the political problems that have emerged by the membership of Russia, for example. But I think countries are now thinking about a more pragmatic and incremental approach to regional integration, still recognizing the benefits of that integration in terms of boosting efficiency and productivity in national economies through increased trade and investment, by creating greater security of policy and removal of customs and other types of red tape that raise transaction costs and impugn competitiveness of national goods and services. And I think there will be an attempt to try to meld together, and that's an interesting term, Ambassador. It came from your Prime Minister in a speech he gave at the 60th anniversary of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council 2 years ago in Washington. He talked about the importance of integration, of continuing integration, but of melding together the various approaches that were being discussed and pursued in the Asia-Pacific region. Not necessarily harmonizing or docking or linking, but melding has a different term, and it provides more flexibility and adaptation. And it goes back to some of the original concepts that George Yeo propounded back more than a decade ago about the importance of regional integration and building up from a core group of countries. At that time, he called it the P5. And in fact, at one time at my institute, he said, no, it should be the P6 because we need to include Korea. And that type of process is still proceeding now, whether it's ASEAN plus 1, ASEAN plus 3, the 10 plus 6 proposals from Japan, or the various proposals for a trans-Pacific partnership, which can take on a different form and have attracted a lot of interest by the Obama administration. I can see that proceeding in part because if you look at the small group of core countries, Singapore, Chile, New Zealand, Brunei, now the United States adding, many other important countries in the Asia-Pacific region already have trade agreements with these countries. Korea has a trade agreement with almost all of them. Japan has a trade agreement with many of them. And even China has an agreement with many of them. And I have been doing some thinking that perhaps those who are interested in a Northeast Asia free trade linkage, who have worked on this for a long time, may find it easier to realize that through a somewhat broader regional initiative that brings China in this context and allows a better way of accommodating the differences that arise in the when one works bilaterally with China, either particularly in the Korea China context or the Japan China context, and certainly in the U.S. China context. So I see some important work that can be done in APEC, reviving its momentum that has stalled for the past decade. I applaud the efforts of the Singapore government to do that, not just because of their substantive insight, but because they've provided me the opportunity to come here to speak to you. And I think that we'll see what happens in APEC. But APEC works on multi-year cycles. And so it's important what happens today and this year sets the tone for what can be done next year in Japan and the following year in the United States. So many of the major players in the APEC now have a reason to begin to make progress. And this is the year in which to take advantage of the economic crisis to build for future growth, and including through improve trade and investment relations in the region. So that's an optimistic note, perhaps to end on. I know that you like to conclude the meetings right on time on 9 o'clock. I apologize for overspending your time by a minute or two, but I again want to thank you for the opportunity to join you.
Okay, thank you. I think time has run too much already, and we should get prepared for this afternoon departure. But I could resist to ask one more question.
Sure.
And squeeze some last drop of juice from you. And my question is that could you make a quick assessment of the NAFTA, particularly from Mexico's point of view, because Mexican economic size is very close to Korean economic size, and a lot of misconception is floating around in Korea that Mexico has suffered many areas because of that. So I think that may have clarify some misconceptions among Koreans, particularly in the National Assembly.
Okay.
You have to postpone your departure.
I was going to say, my colleague Gary Huffburn and I wrote a book a few years ago. It's only 500 pages, and it's addressed to that very question. So let me summarize that book in the next 5 seconds.
Yeah.
No, if I would draw one lesson, there was a big problem in Mexico. And the reason why Mexico has not been able to take full advantage of the NAFTA, despite making substantial strides in reforming its policies in anticipation of the agreement in the early 1990s, is that it did not follow up with the appropriate investment and adjustment in its own economy. And that, in part, was due to the fact that within a year of entry into force of the NAFTA, Mexico fell into economic crisis, the peso crisis, had a very sharp recession in the year after NAFTA entered into force. And the response to that economic crisis, though helped significantly by its partnership with the United States and Canada, led Mexico to pursue an overly tight monetary and fiscal policy. Macroeconomic policy became very conservative, but it limited the possibilities for investment, particularly in infrastructure. And it inhibited the political room for economic reform, particularly in the energy sector. So those were areas where Mexico fell short, and it was, I think, instructive that the day that Korean officials shook hands on the Chorus FTA in April of 2007, the Deputy Prime Minister introduced proposals for substantial domestic economic reforms and investments to deal with the prospective challenges that would face the Korean economy as it opened up to more competition from the United States. That was exactly what Mexico didn't do, and it was indeed something that the United States was very deficient in doing, and which President Obama now has to redress, and has begun to do so through substantial investments in the stimulus package and in an expanded trade adjustment assistance program. So the lesson there is you have to adapt your own national policies to be able to take advantage of the trade and investment opportunities created by the trade agreement. And those that do so at home can reap the dividends abroad.
Thank you so much. I think it's time for us to release him. And I really thank you for all of you to for participating in this exciting forum, and especially thanks for Jeffrey Schott for making time to make a stop over here in Seoul. Thank you very much.